In this series on the miracles in Mark, we are reminding ourselves over and over again that there is no Greek word, miracle, that is a choice of translators to English. The word in Greek, or actually words in Greek, are four words that are used and sometimes translated as miracle: powers, signs, works, and wonders. And very often it's just one of those words that appears, and sometimes it's more than one. But in a story like today's, none appears whatsoever, telling us that this is a miracle. It's just put out for us, and we get to dance with this scripture. Now, this one story is told more often in the Gospels than any other story. It is told 6 times, 1 in each of the 4 Gospels, and twice in both Mark and in Matthew's Gospel. And the version we read today is the longest retelling of this story. So why was this particular story so significant to those who wanted to record what Jesus had done and transmit that to future generations so that others could believe and know who Jesus was and what Jesus was up to? To be sure, this story signifies a tremendous amount to those who passed it from one to the next. It's a kind of epiphany, a kind of showing forth of who Jesus is. Well, honestly, isn't that true of all of Jesus's work? It tells us something. But I do think that the story of feeding the 5,000 richly portrays things about Jesus that we are meant to receive and ponder and know. The context of this, as the disciples gather, is that this is a kind of pulling in of the interns, as it were, the students that Jesus has been working with, for them to report back on all that they've been up to. And after Jesus hears that, it is Jesus' desire to give them some rest. The scripture even goes so far to say that they've been so busy they haven't had time to eat. So we already are hearing something about the need of rest and the hunger. They then discover that they have been followed to the place of rest, and Jesus sees all the crowds, sees that they have no sense of leadership amongst them, and offers them a teaching that takes some time, and so folks are hungry. The crowd is all restless for some food. The disciples want to send the crowd away, but Jesus says, no, you give them something to eat. You give them something to eat. And indeed, in this particular story, we note that Jesus actually uses the loaves and fish that they have with them in order to feed the large crowd. We focus on the wonder of this act, as we do with all these stories, not so much asking how this happened, but why it happened. To what end? These stories of miracles are always meant not to elicit in us some sort of scientific curiosity, but rather to elicit in us a kind of curiosity about the person of Jesus. I wonder in the story whether the crowd even knows what has happened. We're not sure whether they witness the way the disciples do, that so little has turned into so much. But what we do know is that Jesus in this story enables his disciples to understand their calling in a new way and to live it out in a new way. It also anticipates the communion that Jesus will leave with us as we hear the same verbs that we hear when communion is celebrated. Jesus takes loaves, blesses them, breaks them, and gives them. It's the same set of verbs: takes, blesses, breaks, and gives. So let's go back to our 4 words that get translated as miracle and think about this story with those words. Works. This story tells us about how Jesus works to enable food and the feeding of many, and how Jesus works to enable community around a meal. I'm going to take a pause there to remember our service of light and dark that was part of our Remade and Hope grant experience. We had an amazing worship service and then went over to the community house and had dinner. And many people commented on how meaningful that whole evening was. I have thought and thought about this and thought about how wonderful it was that people who had a moving experience here then had the opportunity to sit and reflect together about that experience before they went home, and how that helped to gel the experience, but also gel something about community around those tables. So in a very real way, Jesus's work was to create community and to help people absorb his teachings. Jesus had power over the elements, over the bread, and over the fish. Jesus also had power to equip his disciples so that they could be feeders as well. Jesus had the power to create community. Jesus had the power to create and bring forth generosity and sharing amongst those who were there gathered. Wonder. We may wonder that so many were fed from so few provisions. We may wonder that there is leftovers. We may wonder about the plenty that is possible when Jesus is in our midst. We may wonder about what work is possible when we are empowered by Jesus. Sign. This story is full of signs about what God has in mind and is trying to enact through Jesus. God is showing God's intention to care for and to create community amongst God's people. God is showing God's desire to nourish and to feed and to hold together the community. God is showing signs that there is plenty, that we live in a world where there is sufficient for all, provided we share with one another and we sit in community with one another. Here at this table, we can look for just these same works, powers, wonders, and signs. So as we gather in a few minutes around it, bring to the table your questions, your wonderments, your curiosity that you might discover here what power God intends to give to us, what work God intends to inspire in us, what sign of God's desires for us is present here, and what a wonder it is that this mystery is ours to share from age to age.